What if the effort to constantly defend who you are is the very source of your psychological exhaustion? Most modern individuals spend a remarkable amount of mental and emotional energy maintaining a coherent sense of self. This effort shows up in subtle but pervasive ways, defending opinions in conversation, justifying emotional reactions, protecting personal narratives, and maintaining consistency across social roles. Much of daily cognition is spent ensuring that the image of me remains intact, respectable, and unchallenged. But this raises an intellectually interesting question. Is the self actually something that must be protected? Or is it a mental construct whose constant defense creates unnecessary internal conflict? This video approaches that question analytically rather than devotionally. We are not asking whether the self should be dissolved in a mystical sense, but whether the assumption that the self requires defense is cognitively accurate. To explore this, we turn to Ibn Arabi, not as a poetic mystic, but as a rigorous metaphysician concerned with perception, identity, and the structure of reality. His work offers a surprisingly precise framework for understanding what happens psychologically and cognitively when self-defense is relinquished. The contemporary psychological landscape is characterized by elevated stress, emotional reactivity, and identity polarization. Individuals report feeling perpetually under threat, socially, professionally, and ideologically. Digital environments intensify this condition. Social media platforms reward self-reference, comparison, and public positioning, increasing the frequency with which identity is activated and evaluated. From a psychological perspective, this aligns with classic ego defense mechanisms described by Freud and later ego psychologists: denial, projection, rationalization, and reaction formation. These mechanisms are not pathological in themselves. They are adaptive responses to perceived threat. However, when threat perception becomes chronic, defense becomes the default mode of operation. Cognitive load theory adds another layer. Maintaining a consistent self-concept requires attentional resources. When those resources are constantly allocated to self-monitoring and self-justification, less capacity remains for learning, creativity, and flexible reasoning. Neuroscience provides further insight. Activity in the brain's default mode, network associated with self-referential thought and narrative construction, increases during rumination. When overactive, the DMN correlates with anxiety and depression. The core problem, then, is not simply external pressure. It is the assumption that the self is a fragile entity that must be continuously defended. This assumption produces vigilance, rigidity, and reduced cognitive flexibility. But what if that assumption itself is the source of strain? Ibn Arabi, who lived from 1165 to 1240, was an Andalusian philosopher, jurist, and metaphysician. While often labeled a mystic, his primary concern was conceptual rigor. He was deeply interested in how reality is structured and how perception generates experience. A common misconception is that Ibn Arabi denies individuality or lived experience. He does not. Instead, he questions the ontological status of the individual self. In his framework, the self-nafs is not an independent essence, but a relational construct. Identity arises through perception, naming, memory, and contrast. It is assembled rather than discovered. His central metaphysical principle, Wahdat al-Wujud, or unity of being, functions as a cognitive framework. Multiplicity exists at the level of appearance, while unity exists at the level of reality. This distinction matters psychologically. If the self is not a fixed entity, then defending it as though it were, becomes a logical error. Letting go of defense does not imply annihilation. It implies correcting a mistaken assumption. According to Ibn Arabi, the self has no independent existence outside perception and relation. It is a temporary configuration of qualities, roles, and states. What you call me is an ongoing process, not a substance. This process is assembled through several components. Memory provides continuity by linking past narratives. Anticipation projects those narratives into the future. Social mirroring reinforces identity by reflecting how others respond to you. Modern psychology reaches similar conclusions. Constructivist models describe the self as a narrative structure rather than a fixed entity. In neuroscience, predictive processing models suggest that the brain maintains a self-model that is continuously updated based on prediction error. Consider a practical example. A person receives critical feedback at work and experiences it as a personal attack. Objectively, the feedback is information about performance. The emotional reaction arises because a self-image, competent, respected, secure, is perceived as threatened. When the self is understood as provisional, criticism loses its existential charge. It becomes data rather than danger. This shift increases psychological resilience by reducing over-identification. Ibn Arabi makes a deceptively simple logical claim. What you defend, you solidify. Defense grants ontological weight to what is otherwise fluid. When the self is constantly defended, the mind reinforces the belief that this self is real, fixed, and endangered. Psychological research supports this paradox. Wegner's work on the irony of mental control shows that actively suppressing or guarding against thoughts often strengthens them. Attention bias operates similarly. When attention is oriented toward threat, perceived danger increases. This is why defending identity labels, political, cultural, professional, often escalates conflict. Disagreement is experienced as existential rather than intellectual. Non-defense weakens false solidity. The self becomes adaptable and responsive rather than rigid and reactive. Importantly, non-defense does not mean passivity. It means responding without identity entanglement, engaging without overinvestment in self-image. For Ibn Arabi, knowledge depends on the capacity of perception. Reality discloses itself according to how open perception is. A defended self narrows this openness. Defensive cognition filters information to preserve coherence. Data that contradicts identity is discounted or distorted. This limits learning. From a neuroscientific perspective, reduced threat perception allows greater prefrontal regulation, enhancing cognitive flexibility and integrative thinking in real-world terms. A non-defensive listener hears nuance, where a defensive one hears threat. Letting go of defense expands the perceptual field. This aligns precisely with Ibn Arabi's view. As self-contraction decreases, knowledge increases. A major misconception is that losing the self implies psychological collapse. Ibn Arabi draws a clear distinction. Functional identity remains. Illusory centrality dissolves. Modern psychology supports this distinction. Self-transcendent experiences are associated with increased well-being, not dysfunction. Practices that cultivate decentering, such as mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, improve emotional regulation by reducing identification with thoughts. A professional, for example, can perform their role efficiently without ego inflation. Competence does not require self-importance. Health lies not in eliminating the ego, but in making it transparent. There is a structural paradox here. Letting go of defense increases stability. Defense assumes fragility. Non-defense reveals resilience. In Ibn Arabi's metaphysical logic, only illusions require protection. Reality is self-sustaining. This teaching is epistemological, not escapist. Ethical responsibility remains. Social boundaries still exist. What changes is the assumption that identity itself is under threat. These ideas translate into practical cognitive skills. The first step is cognitive reframing, noticing moments of self-defense. Metacognitive awareness allows you to observe the impulse to protect identity without immediately acting on it. Emotion regulation strategies involve pausing before reaction and allowing prediction, error, letting new information update the self. Research shows that mindfulness-based interventions reduce DMN overactivity, while acceptance-based therapies increase psychological flexibility in disagreement. The shift is subtle but powerful, from I am being threatened to information is being presented. These are not spiritual beliefs. They are empirically supported cognitive adjustments. When self-defense relaxes, several transformations occur. Emotional reactivity decreases. Cognitive clarity improves. Perception expands. Ibn Arabi's core insight is not that the self disappears, but that it loses its false centrality. Energy previously spent on protection becomes available for understanding. Psychological freedom emerges not from constant self-improvement, but from self-relaxation. The question then is no longer who am I defending, but what becomes possible when nothing needs to be defended.